Today could not happen without the help and efforts of our moderator Munib Nasir and our special guest Archbishop and Primate Linda Nichols. I would like to introduce our moderator. Munib Nasir is a religious and philanthropic leader and interfaith activist who is respected for his knowledge and involvement in religious and current affairs. Munib is the co-chair of National Muslim Christian Liaison Committee and is the founder and president of the Olive Tree Foundation, an endowment foundation and granting agency. He is also the managing editor of the online Canadian Muslim magazine, Ikra. Over the years, Munib has founded a number of charities and served on boards and advisory committee, includes on the steering committee of the Parliaments of the World's Religions and the Scarborough Hospital Advisory Council. He is a frequent guest speaker at institutions where he promotes greater intercommunity and interfaith understanding and active citizenship. Educated at the University of Toronto and University of Guelph, Munib retired from distinguished career as a senior analyst at the Legislative Assembly of Ontario. He also has professional certification in not-for-profit management and interfaith understanding. So welcome, and I would like to hand over to you, Mr. Munib.
Thank you, Bushra, and thanks to the Intercultural Dialogue Institute for organizing this event this evening. I welcome everyone to this dialogue with the Anglican Archbishop of Canada, Linda Nichols, on the topic of hope and solidarity in today's world. Peace be with you and good evening. I hope and pray that everyone is doing well and keeping safe. Today's event is part of an ongoing series of events organized by the Intercultural Dialogue Institute of the Greater Toronto Area to advance dialogue and reflection on issues affecting all of us. And I'm delighted to have been chosen to moderate this virtual event. We begin by acknowledging that we walk upon the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples, and we recognize their history, spirituality, culture, and stewardship of the land. We are grateful to all Indigenous groups for their commitment to protect the land and its resources, and we are committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. Let me also begin by giving thanks for all those working over this past year to combat the COVID-19 virus and who are risking their own well-being out of love for their neighbors. And we give thanks for all those who work to provide for our daily needs. And we must also give thanks to the scientists around the world who collaborated and stood together in solidarity to develop a vaccine in less than a year. This is an incredible and historical accomplishment. Their achievement has given us hope. And we pray that God grants them and us the courage, the compassion, the patience we need to survive this challenging time and to come out of this pandemic stronger as a more faithful people and as a more just global community. The format of this evening's session is that shortly Archbishop Linda Nichols will provide her reflections on the topic of hope and solidarity in today's world, after which we'll engage in a discussion and you, the audience, will have an opportunity to ask questions. So please submit your questions in the chat box and we will get to them later. It has been a most difficult year for all of us. And we're all naturally anxious about the pandemic, worried about our family and our friends and what the future holds. This year has humbled us and reminded us that we are all equal in our vulnerability and fragility. While the COVID-19 crisis reminds us of our shared fragility, it also demonstrates how everything and everyone is truly connected. We see the ecological order is connected to the human condition. We see that eradicating this pandemic in one society will never be achieved unless it is done in all societies. And we're seeing that the success and the safety of the frontline responders are linked to our willingness to stay home. It is at this moment when we need to stay at safe distances that we are finally brought together as one human family, standing together to combat this pandemic and standing together for a better future. So how can we keep walking forward with hope and find renewal at this time that has been so difficult? How can we hold on to our sense of what is whole and true and support each other even in the face of loss? And how can religion and spirituality build people up and provide a sense of meaning and inner strength during these troubled times? To reflect on these questions, it is our pleasure to welcome Archbishop Linda Nichols, who is the Archbishop and Primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. Archbishop Nichols is the first woman to head the Anglican Church of Canada and the second female primate in the Anglican Communion. Previously, she served the church as the Bishop of Huron, the area Bishop of Trent Durham, and the Diocese of Toronto. She holds degrees in music and education and taught high school for 5 years before engaging in theological studies at Wycliffe College at the University of Toronto, and she was ordained as a priest in 1986. She holds a Doctor of Ministry degree from the University of Toronto. In addition to her many positions in the church, she's also been in many positions in the ecumenical and interfaith community, and she has served as the co-chair of the Anglican Roman Catholic Dialogue in Canada, and she is a member of the Third Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. So it's my pleasure to welcome Archbishop Nichols, and I invite her to reflect on hope and solidarity in today's world. Archbishop Nichols.
Thank you very much, Munib. It is a pleasure to be with you tonight, both here in Canada and I understand from other parts of the globe. When I was growing up, a trip on an airplane was a major and unusual event. Most people worked within a moderate distance from their home, and if we traveled, it was by car and not usually longer than a day away. Since then, travel has escalated so that people see a plane trip as nothing extraordinary. Fostered by the globalization of business, the vacation travel industry, and extended by migrant movements, wars, refugee crises, and climate change, trans-global travel is frequent and common. So at one time, cultures and faiths were separated by long and difficult journeys. Now they are living as physical neighbors in every part of Canada. I still remember my surprise at visiting Iqaluit on Baffin Island and finding Sikhs living and working there. In 2005, I was the coordinator for Dialogue for Ethics, Interfaith Relations, and Congregational Development for the Anglican Church of Canada. In that role, I took a course on world religions and discovered that there were practitioners of every major religion of the world right in the city of Toronto. We visited worship and faith centers for many and spoke with people living these faiths in the same city, including Wiccans, Orthodox and Reform Jews, Sikhs and Zoroastrians, Muslims, Buddhists and Christians, Roman Catholic and Orthodox, all living in one city in Canada and even beside each other within a couple of blocks. We live as neighbors globally and locally. We share political and social systems together. We know there are some who foster division and hatred, who blame those who have arrived later and are different from, quote, us, the earlier arrivals, usually white. We also know the power of racism in our midst that exists in attitudes, structures, systems, and people, and affects all of us, whether we are those with social power or those who suffer abuse and discrimination. How then shall we live together in ways that foster hope and solidarity and do not foster hatred, racism, and division? As faith communities, we share the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. There is not, however, a one-to-one correspondence. It does not mean that because I like ice cream, you have to like ice cream. Rather, it asks us to consider the principles that give us life and hope, and ensure what is needed for the other to experience that too, as we seek the common good for all. And so I'd like to explore 4 principles that may assist us in fostering understanding and solidarity as we live together. The first is the acknowledgement of our shared humanity in the life of this planet, the recognition of our common humanness, that all receive life as a gift from the Creator. None of us chose the time or the place of our birth. It is a gift that placed us in a particular culture, faith, community, and experiences. And we each have been formed and shaped by that gift. As adults, we may reject some aspects of that formation while we affirm others. We understand the world through the lens of a particular faith perspective. And now we live side by side with people whose formation was different than ours. And we live in this place, Canada, formed and shaped by its history as a colony of Britain, with Judeo-Christian principles in its governance and laws. There's a wonderful very recent television commercial by Tim Hortons. If for those of you not in Canada, Tim Hortons is a ubiquitous chain of coffee houses. And the advertisement on television shows different families building snowmen, decorated in the traditions of their community, with the final comment, "We are all made of the same snow." So we need to acknowledge our common humanity, and then need to acknowledge the complexities of our relationships. We share the same physical and social spaces. Some have come recently as refugees or immigrants. Others are first and second generation Canadian born. Others are descendants of colonial settlers. And some are the remaining and original Indigenous peoples of this land. And each shares a part of Canadian history that needs to be told from those different perspectives. For example, Indigenous people tell the history of this land very differently than colonial settlers have told it. We are learning that the doctrine of discovery is a fiction we need to reject. Jewish immigrants remind Canada of our story of anti-Semitism during World War II, when we rejected the MS St. Louis ship of refugees fleeing the violence of Nazi Germany, or the Komagata Maru ship of East Indian immigrants turned away in 1914. even as we also hear the stories of refugees today, thankful for sponsoring churches and communities or for sheltering them from injustice. We learn about ourselves when we listen to each other's story and the complexities of those stories. Thirdly, we need to talk about our shared values for the common good that will allow for and learn from different perspectives. It is not just about equality, it is about equity. In order to do this, we must listen deeply to the other so that we are not simply imposing what we think is important from only our perspective. This is certainly easiest around our desires for our families and our basic needs of shelter, food, and work that provides for our needs and uses the gifts and skills of all, nurturing children to their full potential, living in peace with freedom to practice our faith. It is, however, harder when our perceptions of the values of the other differ significantly and conflict with the social structures around us. This has been true in the perception of aspects of different faith communities around things like the rights of women in Canada, or certainly in recent times in the conversations about the turban, the hijab, or the niqab. We are quick to want the golden rule to mean that the ways in which I can live in Canada must be shared by others who choose differently or are perceived not to have a choice. This is where the dialogue about values and expectations must go deeper and explore the intersection between social and faith values and the common good. Each faith tradition lives with a somewhat uneasy relationship with the wider world that does not share its faith perspective, and with each other. And there will be tensions that require discussion and not simply rejection or demonization. We also need to recognize that people exist within communities and not only as individuals, and the balance of responsibilities between the individual and the community may be different in different cultures and faith communities. And the challenge we face is a challenge as much within each faith tradition as it is between faith traditions. The challenge we face is reaching a level of trust with one another that allows us to talk about values that are so important. We are reluctant to risk vulnerability about them with others. And we are still building that trust. It comes through organizations like this interfaith dialogue community that seeks to build relationships. It comes from becoming friends with our neighbors of all faiths. And it requires both those who have settled here for a long time and those who are new to be willing to reach out and share with one another. We also face radical elements within all traditions. Those who believe their way of expressing the faith is the only right way and seek to impose it on others or to treat the other as inferior, inciting violence and discrimination. And this is true in each of our traditions. Though I would say we are much better at seeing only the good in ourselves and pointing out the worst in the other. We need to acknowledge the ways in which our faith traditions have fostered and encouraged harm to others. Some years ago, I shared in planning and attending a seminar in which a scholar from each of the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions shared in presenting from their own scriptures the texts of terror that have been used against the others. It was an opportunity for deep vulnerability together in acknowledging the painful histories we each have and for sharing how our traditions have other ways of interpreting and understanding those texts that do not foster harm and hate. And finally, we need to partner together for the common good wherever possible. When issues affect us all, we must speak with one voice, for that is the voice of hope. When one partner is injured by discrimination, prejudice, or hatred, we need to stand together. In my own ministry, I have rejoiced to see those moments. After the massacre at the Quebec Mosque a few years ago, there was an outpouring of solidarity. In London, where I live, one of the Anglican clergy arranged a rally within 12 hours of the massacre and invited the mayor, the chief of police, and religious leaders from the Jewish, Roman Catholic, Anglican, and United Churches to join on the steps of the mosque with some 200 citizens to proclaim our solidarity with the Muslim community and to protest such hate crimes. I have seen it happen when a Jewish cemetery in the area that I was a minister was desecrated. And the whole ministerial of Christian churches in the area wrote a letter to each synagogue in the city, declaring our support for them and our outcry against acts of anti-Semitism. I was overwhelmed by the responses from the Jewish community, who were in tears of joy that others stood with them in those moments. I now experience it when Christian leaders join interfaith leaders to write to our national government on issues that affect us all for the common good, whether that is around climate change, medically assisted death, poverty, or homelessness, just to name a few. So fostering hope and solidarity asks us in each of our faith traditions to recognize we share a common humanity, a shared gift of life as neighbors. It calls us to be willing to listen to and with others for shared values for the common good, and to share deeply, to understand when our values seem to differ. It calls us to be willing to engage in self-examination in the presence of the other, to understand and redeem painful histories. And it calls us to partner wherever possible for the common good. It is in these ways of living together that we will foster hope and solidarity. And this work is not easy and it is not quick. It will be misunderstood by fundamentalist elements in our own traditions. It will ask of us humility in looking at our own tradition and faith, even as we celebrate the elements of strength and beauty and common shared values with the other. We are the children of one Creator, and the diversity and creativity of that creation is wonderful to behold and challenging to live. I pray that we may commit ourselves to this task that is so necessary as we live as neighbors in this world, both immediately in our own local community and as global neighbors in a world where we must stand globally in hope and solidarity as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Archbishop Nichols, for these words of reflection, reminding us of our shared humanity, the complexities of our relationship, and calling upon us to work for the common good and to partner in working for the common good. At this time, I would like to remind you that those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can submit your questions and we'll get to them later. At this time, I'd like, I know I have my MC as well has a few questions. So let me begin by asking a couple of questions. I noted in your remarks, Archbishop Nichols, you referred to the doctrine of discovery. And I saw a statement that came out at the beginning of Advent that was issued by 4 churches. And it was entitled Churches Beyond Borders, Advent Call to Address Racism and White Supremacy. And if I may read a few lines from this statement, it says, and I quote, As leaders of four churches on a shared continent and with shared complicity in the legacies of the doctrine of discovery, the enslavement of Black people, and the mistreatment of all people of color, we hear the prophets and the Spirit speaking clearly when we listen together. This Advent, we feel called to name the truth that the sin of racism and white supremacy is ongoing. People continue to be subjected and oppressed by these systemic evils, even within our own churches and the ecumenical movement, end of quote. I thought this was quite a significant statement that came in this year that saw the systemic inequalities in our world being revealed. So I just ask you to speak to us briefly about this call and the role of religious communities in addressing these issues head on.
Yes, this statement came from the fact that the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, the Anglican Church in Canada, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and the Episcopal Church have ongoing conversations amongst the leaders, and we are very closely linked together in our work. And one of the issues that has emerged, it's not a new issue, but it has emerged with renewed force in the last few years, is the issue of dismantling racism. And it is always easier to see it outside of ourselves as somewhere else outside in the community. And we always love to say, you know, we are not, you know, I'm not a racist. We like to say that. Nobody wants to say, of course I'm a racist. No, nobody's going to say that. And the challenge is that racism is not just about individual words or actions. It's a way of structuring and fostering the whole social milieu. It's the sea we swim in, where we make assumptions about those who differ from us, and particularly those who differ, who are racialized by color. So that has been kind of embedded in our social networks. And Canadians have unfortunately liked to point the finger at the United States and say, oh no, but we're not racist. And Canadians have a lot to learn about the racism that has been embedded in our relationship with Indigenous peoples and in the racism that continues and has always existed for other racialized communities. Black people who've come to Canada right from the earliest days of Canada are very clear about their treatment in Nova Scotia. Others who came up through the Underground Railroad are very aware of how they were treated in Canada. And slavery was not unknown in Canada. We don't like to admit it, but it was here. And I know that other people of color who've immigrated or come as refugees in recent years, the last century or so, have all expressed moments of racist prejudice against them. It's there, we see it in our news. And as a leader of a church, I'm deeply aware that it's in my own church. And Anglicans are wrestling with this today as we try to address how racism lives in our systems and what we will do to raise up awareness about it and change it. This is hard work and it's painful work, and it will require us to see what we, particularly those of us who are white settlers, what we have been blind to and what we have not seen, not recognized, and not changed. So the leaders of the four churches, which are now, we're calling ourselves Churches Beyond Borders, just to give a title to this particular group, are committed to that work, particularly because in Canada, we've had a somewhat longer history of addressing it with our relationship with Indigenous peoples and reconciliation. But the American churches have had a more work on anti-Black racism and have done more in that regard. And so we hope to learn from each other as we meet together, as our staff and our bishops and clergy meet together.
Thank you. That's this is one of the things that has been, I think it's good that the religious communities are addressing these issues in the open. We sometimes fail to admit that we have that sort of discrimination or racism within our own communities. And I noted as well that within the Anglican Church, you also have the Black Anglicans,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
which is quite an important thing to be doing within a church as well, to recognizing the diversity within our own faith communities and the difficulties faced by members within our own faith communities.
Yes, we've not, we are very aware that our leadership is not reflective of the fullness of our church. And so we have some work to do on how do we raise up leadership that is reflective of the diversity that we have. And Black Anglicans Canada is going to be one of the groups helping us to do that.
I know in your biography, as I read it, you have a wide experience in ecumenical and interfaith work. And over the last decade or so, there have been a greater number of coming together of various faith communities, especially between the Muslim and the Christian communities. There was the issue of the common word, and recently Pope Francis issued his Fratelli Tutti, calling for fraternity and social friendship. How important do you think this ecumenical interfaith work is at this moment, when we are, speaking about a new normal and coming out of this with a new type of world? How important do you think the ecumenical interfaith movement is, at this moment in structuring a new way of religious communities living together?
I think its importance has not changed. I don't think the pandemic has changed the critical nature of that because of the globalization of the world. It was easier when people could say, well, those people live over there and we live here and we don't have to worry about it. But now the world functions, we are interconnected at every level, economically, socially. The pandemic is proof of that. What happened in China, or at least is understood to have started in China, very quickly spread around the globe, and it would be almost impossible for it not to have. And so therefore, the work we do in fostering understanding, in recognizing one another, and in getting past the prejudices or the stereotypes that stand in the way between faith communities, is really critical. And so I continue to see it as important. And the ecumenical movement has always understood that for Christians, we have this huge diversity of Christian expressions. But the call of the gospel, particularly in the Gospel of John, Jesus prayed that they may be one. A unity of understanding, a unity of practice and engagement together. Doesn't mean we have to look identical, but it does mean we need to acknowledge that we share the same faith, and we have to honor and respect one another and work together. And so that's where the ecumenical dialogue is critical, but it's equally as critical between faiths to understand that we live together, we share this world, and for many of the faiths, we have a shared understanding of the one God, the one creator of all. And I loved reading Rabbi Jonathan Sacks because he has a wonderful way of expressing our relationship, particularly between Muslims, Jews, and Christians, as being that of siblings. We share common texts. And the reason he describes the reason we sometimes are in such tension and conflict is not because we're so different, but because we share so much in common, and that we're like siblings in a family fighting. And I've appreciated that perspective, helping to recognize that we have more in common than we realize, and we need to understand that and get to know one another. And the way to do that is to build the relationships.
Yeah, he spoke about the dignity of difference.
Yes,
which was a great phrase that he coined, and he recently passed, so it's lost to the world. He was a great figure in the religious communities.
His more recent book, Not in God's Name, decrying the kind of violence that's perpetuated in the name of God between our faiths when we actually need to understand how we each read our texts and come together around them.
Before going to the viewer's question, I think Bushra has a few questions as well, so I'll pass it on to her.
Yes, when you were talking about principles on achieving solidarity, you said that it is very important to recognize our shared humanity. And you also just said that we are like siblings and we share a lot of similarities between. But I want to ask how important it is to talk about our differences in understanding each other. Do you think it will like create further conflicts, or is it a way to understand and like accept our values and differences?
Yeah, when I say common humanity, I mean literally that we are human beings, that we are physically very much the same. If you looked at the DNA of human beings across the world, there's very little difference. We tend to think of the other as being completely other. And so first of all, recognize we are all human beings under God. But then as we look at our values and the way we've been formed and shaped both by our culture, by our faith, by the location of our birth, there will be things that we value differently, and we need to listen to why that happens. You know, what is it that you value, and why do you value that? And often we discover things. We discover things that we appreciate and can share have shared values around when we understand the background, when we understand what it means to the other. If we haven't asked the question or haven't understood what it means in the context of that culture, that faith tradition, and we haven't heard somebody from that living tradition express it, if we've only looked at the stereotypes, we have missed the heart, and it's the heart we need. And I think we can live with differences. Some of those differences will be very difficult. I think we've seen that. I also think we have to respect that each person is in a relationship with the divine where they have to choose how they will express that relationship. So it's not up to me to declare that that person is wrong because of the way they are expressing that relationship with God. And to respect the dignity of the other, that they have power to choose. And my task is only to share faithfully and as articulately as I can why I might hold a different view and a different place, and then to dialogue about that.
Thank you very much. My other question is, as we were talking about the contemporary world and how we can achieve solidarity in contemporary world, what is the role of social media in achieving solidarity?
Well, I'd find it easier to address how social media is better at dividing than uniting.
Yes,
I think we've seen an awful lot of division caused by the use of social media, but I do think that those of us that do not like what we see on social media have to claim a space in that social media for other views, and challenge back and say to build by reflecting back times and opportunities for engagement with the other. So whether it's making sure that events like this are on social media, showing people that interfaith dialogue exists, is important, and is shared. I think also any opportunity we have across our faiths to honor and uphold one another's traditions. As a Christian leader, trying to be aware of the important days for another faith community, whether that's the ending of Eid for a Muslim community, whether it's Yom Kippur or Hanukkah, being aware of when those opportunities are happening, and celebrating those, with a message of hope and a message of encouragement. I think we can do that on social media and say that that's one of the ways to highlight that it's possible to hold that together.
Yes, I agree, and I also think that like after the Black Lives Matters movement, there's a lot of support for the black businesses on social media.
Yes.
So it's very important to share what you support, make people aware of it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
That's all my questions.
Yeah.
We can proceed to the questions of the viewers.
Okay, thank you, Bushra. I think
Thank
our
you.
other co-host, Sophia, has a few questions as well. Sophia?
Yes, hello. Um, we mostly talk about discrimination caused by religion or race, but there is other ways of discrimination as well. In your own experience, how is it like to be a religious woman, a religious leader as a woman? Like, have you ever faced any difficulties, particularly because of this?
It was more of an issue in the early years. I was ordained in the Anglican Church of Canada in 1985. And that was about 8 years after women began to be ordained in Canada. So there were still people who struggled with it. And, that kind of change that's significant and radical within a faith tradition takes time. And it takes gentleness and awareness that what is going to change for people is going to come through bringing together their theoretical or theological framework with their experience with the life of the church. And so it was not mine to demand their approval. It was mine to be as faithful a representative as I could of what I was called to do and be. And to do that graciously, I'd have to say I did not have to experience some of the radically overt and just nasty responses that some women did experience. And usually I found that once people had experienced the ministry of women pastorally, when you sat with them in illness, when you presided at a funeral, when you celebrated at a baptism, when you walked with them in a rite for marriage, that's what changed people's hearts and minds when they realized that what they were experiencing was good. And so that has changed. In recent years, it's not been as much of an issue. When I went to the meeting of the primates in January, I wondered whether there might be some resistance to my presence. I was the only, the previous woman primate has since retired, so I was the only woman in this gathering of about 40 primates. But I would say that my colleagues, whether they agree with the ordination of women or not, were all respectful because they recognize that our relationship is like a diplomatic relationship. And that whether you like it or agree with it, the call is to respect the dignity of every human person. And the dignity of that person, whether you agree with whether they should be there, they are there because their church or their country or their group has selected them as their leader. And that needs to be honored. And so I experienced a warmth of welcome and collegiality that was gracious. I know that doesn't happen everywhere, but my experience is you have to be yourself and trust that if the church has called you to this position, then, and if God has called you to this position, then God will be with you in it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
We have a question from one of our viewers. And he asks, what could be done in order to fight against racism and discrimination as an individual?
Well, I think the very first thing is to examine oneself for your own attitudes and biases, because we all have them. We all carry some kind of bias that was given to us by how we were formed and shaped and raised, and be aware of those, be aware of when stereotypes pop up in our minds before we've actually met an individual. I think it calls on us to not allow racist comments to go unchallenged. It calls on us to look around us in our daily life, in our workplace, and watch for how others are treated, and be sure that our treatment of others is not colored by racism. I think it's to look at policies and procedures and to ask questions about, are these policies or procedures in our workplace or in our community, are they barriers to people of color? Are they barriers to anybody? Are they barriers to women? Are they barriers to people of differing abilities? How do we break down all of those things that contribute to racist attitudes? It's hard work because we tend to be blinded to what we don't want to see. And we also tend to feel we are powerless in some of the bigger systems that are around us. It takes a lot of courage. It takes courage to say, I know I blew it here. I used the wrong word. I'm on a huge learning curve in my relationship with Indigenous peoples. I did not have much contact with Indigenous peoples in my ministry until the last 5 or 6 years. And I am deeply grateful for Indigenous people who have been very open with me and said, you know, that's not the right language to use. This is the language to use. Or when you say that, that's racist. And so I've had to recognize and constantly be willing to be humble in the face of people who have the courage to tell me. And so when somebody tells me that I've blown it, I need to listen and in Christian language, repent and say, I'm sorry, and I'm trying, and I will continue to try to do better, but I need you to tell me, and I need you to point it out at times, even as I try to learn as I go.
Thank you. I have one question, and I think this is because we are leading up to Christmas and we're in the period of Advent. And this is the most difficult time for the Christian community and for those celebrating Christmas. So I wonder if you have some words of, of hope for those who have experienced great loss and who are under tremendous pressure because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and who may be feeling lonely over these next week or 2 weeks as they celebrate Christmas.
Yes, for Christians, Christmas is often the time that you go and you gather with family and you travel long distances to try and be with family, and that's not going to be possible. I think the Christmas story itself is the place where we find hope, because the Christmas story itself is about Mary and Joseph having to travel a long distance from home in order to respond to a government census. And so they find themselves cut off from family, cut off from those who would support Mary in the birth of a child, cut off from those who would be normally those who would gather around them. And so the Christmas story itself reminds us that the very heart of our faith began with that kind of isolation. And yet in that isolation, God provided angels, shepherds, to be those who recognized and honored and came to visit. We may not be able to have any visitors physically, but we can certainly, in our own family units, share that story, read the story again, be reminded of the simplicity of the heart of it, be reminded that it was about being powerless in the face of something they couldn't control. The census was required. They had no choice. They had to travel to Bethlehem. And so in the midst of that, of their powerlessness, God was there with them. And God will be with us in our homes. And although we may not have shepherds coming to visit, we have Zoom. We can Zoom connect with our families. My family has already set up a time to try and connect from different parts of the country. and we can sing carols together. Well, not really together, on mute. We can still, some people I know are planning to have their Christmas meal on Zoom with their own Christmas dinner in front of them and the rest in other places. We are finding creative ways to respond to difficult circumstances because God's love and care is not limited by physical distance or space. And we have to hold that in a time when the reason for this is because we love our neighbor as ourselves. It's because we're doing this because we care about all those around us, including our family members, that everyone is safe. And so we let go of the trappings of Christmas that we've had in the past in order to embrace something deeper for the sake of others, and trust that God will still reveal God's self to us in the simplicity of the Christmas story and in the opportunities we do have to connect in other ways that technology has allowed us. It will be hard and it will be sad for some, but I hope and pray that in the midst of it, we will find that deeper joy that's at the heart of our faith.
Thank you. I just wanted to read a comment from one of the viewers. And she says that we will be fostering hope and solidarity in today's world all together with these gatherings. Thank you very much. So we're coming to the end of our session, and I'll invite Archbishop Nichols to offer some closing remarks, and then we'll conclude the program. Archbishop Nichols.
Thank you. It's been great to be here. I'm sorry I can't see all the other people that are here present. I can only see the moderators and the hosts. But to thank you for your interest in interfaith conversations, and encourage you that in whatever community you find yourself, there will be an interfaith conversation in that community. And I know there are some pockets of really encouraging and creative work across Canada in interfaith dialogue. And my own experiences of that dialogue, of working with other communities, has been about my learning and my growth and a deeper understanding of the rich grace of God that is present in our world. And that is how we will help our world become a better place. And so I thank you for this night and pray God's blessing on all who are here.
Thank you, Archbishop Nichols, for joining us today. And I wish you a Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and a much better year next year, 2021. To conclude, I will encourage all of us in these moments that the seed of renewal is planted in these difficult moments for enduring this time of uncertainty. And hopefully it will lead to building a brighter future for our world. So let us witness hope to each other, be in solidarity and support of each other, become beacons of light during these uncertain times, and let us spread compassion and love quicker than the COVID-19 virus. We ask for compassion for the suffering that surrounds us, and we pray for healing and for perseverance throughout these challenging times. And I wish everyone viewing us today a happy holiday. Keep well, stay safe. And I thank you, and I pass you back on to Bushra for closing remarks.
Sophia is going to do the closing remarks. I would also like to thank everyone who made this night very special for me and for all of us. It was a really very great program. Thank you very much. Sophia, we are with you.
Okay. So on behalf of the Intercultural Dialogue Institute, I would like to thank Archbishop Linda Nichols, our moderator Munib Nasir, and all of you for watching us today. So Merry Christmas, everyone, and Happy Holidays.